Begin by saying good afternoon, everybody. It is absolutely my great pleasure to be welcoming John Hackston, who is the thought leader at the Briggs Company and is going to be talking to us this afternoon on 100 years of type and of pandemics. So with no further ado, I will hand over to you, John, and say a very warm welcome, and we're all really looking forward to hearing you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Hopefully there are other people who think thoughts at the Briggs Company, but yeah, my job is Head of Thought Leadership, which is really good job title. What it really boils down to a lot of the time is looking at research into type and into the other assessments that we have, and some of that we'll come on to a little bit later. But hopefully what you'll hear in the next hour, I think ties in reasonably fairly neatly with the theme of this year's conference, 100 Years of Type, because it is, after all, indeed 100 years since Psychological Type was published, first in German, and I've been practicing this, so hopefully this is right, as Psychologische Typen, and just under 100 years since the English translation was published a couple of years later. What I'm going to go through is a little bit of a background behind that and how it perhaps is really relevant for our use of type today. Please feel free to put comments in the chat and ask questions in the chat as we go through, but there will be some polls and other things as we come on a little bit later as well. And part of the reason I think it's important to look back is that Carl Jung, after all, wrote, "No one can flatter himself that he's immune to the spirit of his own epoch, or even that he possesses a full understanding of it." Now, admittedly, he wrote that in 1942, not in 1921, but I still think it's very relevant to the publication of psychological types. What sort of world, if you will, was the idea of psychological type born into? Well, just to give you a feel for that, here's some of the major world events of 1921. So here in the United Kingdom, perhaps the biggest event of the year was the conclusion of the Irish War of Independence, which finally came to an end with a peace treaty and the creation of Northern Ireland as a separate country. And as we go through many of these things, you may see some parallels and some reflections about today's society as well. While in the United States, one of the big things that happened that year was something called the Emergency Quota Act was passed. And that was actually about immigration. It was about the number of people who could be immigrants to the United States. It limited the number of people from different countries who could come to the United States and really had its greatest effect on immigrants from Eastern Europe and from Southern Europe. And also in the USA in 1921, it was a year of race riots. Again, perhaps parallels with today. But especially in Tulsa, in Oklahoma, where there was an area which had become known as the Black Wall Street. It was the wealthiest Black district in America. And at the end of May, start of June 1921, a white mob torched that area. Many Black residents were killed, maybe as many as 300 people. Meanwhile, in Russia, there was a serious famine in which probably around about 5 million people died. But at the same time, the new Soviet Union was joined by Crimea and then had a short war with and quickly annexed what was then a separate country of Georgia. And meanwhile, in Germany, Adolf Hitler became the leader of the Nazi Party. So not necessarily the nicest year that you can think of in the past. But here's the thing. All of these events and more were affected or caused by two major things that had taken place just a few years earlier: World War I and what's become known as the Spanish flu. And this pandemic did have profound effects on society, the society the psychological types was born into, but these effects have tended to be overlooked because of the more obvious effects of the war. But for today, with COVID still a big factor in our lives, why we're doing this conference virtually after all, the effects of the Spanish flu, I think, are still really very relevant. So let's look at the Spanish flu in a bit more detail. Now, a picture of a group of people wearing masks is something we're very used to today, although perhaps there's less social distancing going on there. But as we'll see, there's a lot of similarities between then and now. But there's one big difference, and it's a very sad difference, a very sobering difference. The people you see in this picture were much more likely to die from a pandemic than we or our friends or family are. Some estimates suggest that up to 100 million people died worldwide from the Spanish flu. Most likely about 50 million is a more realistic number, and that's what you'll see on this chart. The next largest infectious disease killer of modern times was AIDS, which over a much longer period, the last 40 years roughly, has killed around 35 million people, many of them actually in Africa. Other flu epidemics have killed much smaller numbers, around 1 million from the 1889 flu epidemic, just over 1 million from the 1950s Asian flu, 600,000 from swine flu, and so far, around about 2.95 million people from COVID-19 worldwide. Now, that's still clearly a very large number, but really a fraction of those killed by Spanish flu. And we all know how disruptive COVID has been, so it's not unreasonable to expect that the Spanish flu was really disruptive as well. So we're just going to talk a little bit about the Spanish flu and where it came from, because we don't actually really know where it came from. One thing we can be pretty sure of, though, is that it didn't come from Spain. It was actually first documented, first seen amongst American soldiers, actually in the United States, in an army camp in Kansas. But very soon it was seen in the armies and then the civilian populations of other countries. And most of these countries were involved in the war, so they effectively stopped the press publicizing any knowledge. They censored that information, any knowledge of a disease, so as not to affect wartime morale. But Spain wasn't involved in the war. It didn't censor its press in the same way. So the disease first became public knowledge there. So really very unfairly, it became known as the Spanish flu. But after that, in just a couple of months, it had pretty much spread around the world. But then in August came a second wave of the virus, and this was much more infectious, much deadlier than the first wave. To use words that we've all become familiar with, it's likely that it was a different strain, a different variant of the virus. And then there was a third wave in the first half of 1919, and a fourth and final wave in the spring of 1920. So when Psychological Types was published, the Spanish flu was really a very recent memory. And Chris has made a very valid point in the chat about the effects of the Spanish flu on large populations and how that might affect things like families as well. Now, Jung, of course, was living and working in Switzerland, but the country was affected by the disease just like anywhere else. The picture you can see on the screen at the moment is a picture of Swiss soldiers recovering from the Spanish flu. Switzerland was neutral in the war, but it had mobilized its army to protect its borders, and this meant that soldiers often acted as a conduit for the disease to enter the country. And Switzerland, in the end, suffered quite badly. Now, Carl Jung was actually called up as an army doctor during the war, overseeing an internment camp full of British soldiers and officers, so he'd have been really very well aware of what was going on with the Spanish flu. So what were the effects of the Spanish flu, and what's the relevance of that for today? Well, actually, several of the short-term effects were really very similar to what we're experiencing today. Some places were able to quarantine themselves, especially island countries. So Iceland and Australia, for example, suffered much less than other countries. Several schools and colleges and other institutions managed to quarantine themselves, including, in fact, Swarthmore College, which Isabel attended. Some social distancing was enforced, so many schools and theatres and places of worship were closed, public transportation was reduced, and mass gatherings were banned. Face masks became a very common sight. This dapper German couple are a good example of that. Although just like today, not everybody thought these were a good idea, and there were other complaints and other rebellions against other restrictions that were in place. The pandemic also had the effect of reducing some inequalities in society and increasing others. On the one hand, the combined mortality rate of both the war and the pandemic amongst male soldiers who, remember, were living together in cramped often in sanitary conditions, this meant that there were more jobs available for women, and the case for women having a vote was strengthened, and that meant that trades unions had a greater bargaining power. On the other hand, Black and minority ethnic people suffered more heavy losses than the white majority, and this was exacerbated by society. So, for example, in Philadelphia, the emergency clinics, which had been set up by the Board of Health, barred Black patients from attending. Eventually, one of the city's two segregated African-American hospitals set up an additional clinic for flu patients at a local school. Now, many of these effects ring true today. Black and minority ethnic groups have been more affected today as well. But the one big difference, of course, is that in the 1920s, there was really no effective vaccine and very little other effective treatment. But let's look at some of the longer term effects of the Spanish flu, because some, not all, but some of these might have a lot of relevance for today. And certainly they're very relevant for the world that the idea of psychological types was born into. First of all, it is quite possible that Spanish flu helped the Allies win the war. The evidence suggests that the second and third waves hit the Axis countries first, and mortality rates in Germany and Austria were much higher than in Britain and higher than in France. There were, of course, economic effects, as we've seen in the current pandemic, although these seem to be mostly quite short-term, and some were just an acceleration of existing trends, just like some of the effects that we're seeing with COVID. And there's a good example of this with film and cinema. So just to bring this to life a little bit, we're going to ask you to complete a poll. So Sarah, if you'd like to open that poll. So you should have seen on your screen appearing, do you use a streaming service such as Netflix, Amazon, Prime, or Disney? Okay, if you'd like to answer that poll, and one person has so far. Let's see how many people we get. Okay, well, nearly everybody's voted. Let's stop the poll there and share the results. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so just over half of you, 56% did before COVID lockdown. One person has since COVID lockdown, and six people say no. Now, the reason I showed you that poll, let's stop showing those results. The reason I've shown you that poll actually doesn't fit the text I've decided to say here, because more generally, what the things has been found as before COVID, there's already a drift away from both traditional cinema and TV to streaming services, but lockdown has supercharged it, and the number of people actually taking up those services has actually increased. You as a group are clearly exceptions to that, so congratulations on that. But there's a similar effect in the Spanish flu, because before the Spanish flu, there's already a trend for film studios to try and buy cinemas and create sort of vertical cinemas and studio chains. But cinema closures during the Spanish flu meant that those big studios, which had the finances to wait things out, they were able to buy cinema chains and smaller studios and develop that Hollywood studio system. Now, just like long COVID today, many people who survived the Spanish flu actually had long-term health effects, physical symptoms, and also neurological symptoms. And in fact, this might have been one of the causes of the Second World War in an indirect way. So at the Paris Peace Conference in 1918 and 1919, France, and to an extent Britain, wanted to exact really quite hefty penalties from Germany. Woodrow Wilson, the American president, had taken a much softer line and was initially very forceful in not wanting to punish Germany to too great an extent. But then he caught the Spanish flu. He appeared to recover, and he returned the conference, but he hadn't really recovered. Although he recovered physically, he seemed to lack energy and strength. Some of his aides felt he was paranoid about some topics, and he really didn't seem to care anymore so much about what happened at the conference. He effectively went along with French demands, which exacted very hefty reparations on Germany. That left Germans feeling resentful and open persuasion by groups like the Nazi Party, laying the foundations for the Second World War. Now, one of the other effects was that in many Western countries, there was a real turning away from physical science after the pandemic because people were disillusioned with it. Medicine really hadn't helped as much as they thought it should. And it sparked an interest in alternative medicine, but also in the world of the mind and in psychology, arguably laying the ground for an interest in things like psychological types. And following 1921, well, we had the Roaring Twenties. There were new freedoms, there was new music, there were new movements in art and architecture. And there have been people who have said that following COVID, we may have our own version of the Roaring Twenties coming up over the next few years. In a while, we come back to this and talk about what the implications are for us after COVID. But first of all, I'd like to ask you a question. How do you think people with different type preferences would have reacted to the Spanish flu? And for that matter, what type differences might there be in people's reactions to today's pandemic? I'm not going to ask you to shout out your answers or anything, but jot down a few thoughts or put a few comments in the chat. And what we'll do is come back to those later because we have some data that might help us see what's going on. Okay, just give you a moment to think of any thoughts you have there. Now, of course, we can't go back to 1918 or 1919 or 1920 and see how people with different type preferences reacted to Spanish flu. Psychological types were still a year away from being published, and the whole idea of personality psychology was really very much in its infancy. But what we can do is look at how people today reacted to COVID-19. And that might help us to see what effect the Spanish flu had on individuals. And to do that, we're going to look at results of some research we carried out last year based on 546 people who took part in one of our online surveys. But before we look at the survey results, we're going to give you a chance to give your views. So in a moment, Sarah's going to split you up into a number of breakout groups. And within each group, I'd like you to have a discussion about your feelings about the COVID crisis. So before the breakout groups start, just take a moment to perhaps think about, perhaps write down just for yourself, 3 words or short phrases, if you like, that best describe your feelings about the COVID crisis. Then once you go into your groups, I'd like you to discuss and agree as a group on your top 3 words. By all means, as you're having those conversations, notice any type differences that you're seeing coming out in the source of words that you're choosing. And we're going to give you probably around about 10 minutes to do that. Any questions? We are looking over here is that I put all your lovely smiling faces on a separate pane on a different screen. Any questions? Okay. So in that case, Sarah, if you'd like to start up the groups. And once you see that invite, you'll be able to join in the group. And I'll join one of those groups myself in a moment. Okay, just us, Sarah. You're muted.
How long, John, shall I leave them for?
10 minutes, I think. In fact, I probably won't join a group, actually. I might just...
Okay, so it's 4:20, so 4:30.
4:30. I might join each group in turn, actually, just to see how they're getting on.
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. Let me just make your faces take up a bigger portion of my screen so I can see you all. I'll move you down so I don't hide other things. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So let's have a spokesperson for one of the groups, please. seem to have a picture of your eyebrow or your hand. That's what it was, Angelina. Let's have a, but you know, it was a different view. It was nice. Made a change. Let's have a spokesperson for one of the groups. Who'd like to go first? Rene's got a orange square around it, which suggests he's about to talk.
No, but we didn't appoint any spokesperson, so I'll try. I wrote down some words in terms of the word anxiety came up a lot at the beginning,
okay,
when people didn't know what to expect, what to happen, but also a sense of hope and or you know, the kind of belief that you know, the science and the ingenuity of the human spirit to come up with the vaccine so fast. There was also an aspect of being a bit more cynical about the politicians.
okay.
Of course, I think the main expression that came up for this group will be "fucking fed up." My French, but we all
weirdly in our results, no one actually chose those particular words, but yeah.
That's annoying.
But also the sense that everybody was able to explore something new or something different about themselves or their preference because of the new conditions, you know, and either because it put people more in touch with their family or their village, or it extroverts being able to introvert and experience that side of things as well. So that was also what came out. Have I missed anything, group?
Anything else from Rene's group? Okay, let's have one of the other groups. This is what I get for being non-directive.
I'm the one that wrote everything down.
Okay.
The only word that showed up twice was frustration. And as we talked more among the six of us, everybody agreed that I think everyone agreed that there was some component of that, and anxiety as well. We were all intuitives, I believe. And I don't know that we talked about type differences much as some of the experiential or where we were in the risk factors that changed things.
You want to say a little bit more about that, Jane?
Just being what, you know, someone was talking about having, you know, calculated the risk and mitigating that, and then being more frustrated with restrictions that what went beyond what was necessary, versus someone who maybe, you know, is more in the thick of who is most vulnerable. Just the differences that we experience because of how we were placed in all this.
Thank you. And last but not least, spokesperson for the third group, please. Whoever that's going to be. Okay. Oh, Carmel, you've just remuted yourself.
Sorry. Well, in our group, I guess what came out of it was that it was an opportunity for us, because we had all taken advantage of the time to do different things. We said, you know, some of us had never done as much walking as we have done in the last year. So there was opportunity and also transformation.
Okay.
So I guess seeing the positive sides, although we did talk about feelings of stress and disconnection, there was compassion and then frustration. And another positive was that we had all slowed down, I think.
Okay.
A couple of us had slowed down a bit.
Great, thank you. And I can see in the chat that Catherine, you said anxiety came up for us too. Yeah. So thank you for that. Let me just, if I can try and move your faces over there so I can see my slides. Excellent. Now, what we did is we asked essentially the same question to people who took part in our survey. The caveat I'll say before we look at results is that this was not now, it was very much in the earlier days of the survey. But this is what our survey respondents actually said. Now, there were hundreds of different words mentioned by our survey respondents, but these are the most common ones. The most frequent, really by quite a big margin, was anxiety or anxious, mentioned 56 times across our 150 so people who took part. Then feeling sad, being sad or sadness. But then, and I think this is a word that was used by some of a couple of the groups, opportunity, and so on down the list. Now, these words might be quite small on your screen, but we are going to put a PDF copy of these slides into the course, into the conference information, which you can download later and look at your leisure. Now, of course, there's quite a bit of overlap between these different words. So being anxious at the top there is 100 miles away from being worried, which is, I think, the 5th word down with 30 mentions. So we group those words into themes or categories. And again, you'll see that wider theme of being anxious or confused or worried or fearful or scared was the most common theme with 211 mentions. But you can see down that list, there's quite other few words as well. And Doris says, I think where you experience it, i.e. country, also makes a difference. Most of our data, Doris, was from the United States and the UK. The data, we had an English version survey. It didn't make a huge difference, but there were some very specific differences, but you can download the full research report, which will go into that. Now, I also ask you, and I don't think you really got quite were able to get there at a time, to think about how people with different type preferences might have reacted to Spanish flu or to today's pandemic. And there were a few remarks in the chat, and as Jane rightly said, your life experiences may have affected this as well. But there were some type differences in our data in how likely people were to use some of these words in describing their feelings. So, for example, people with a preference for introversion were significantly more likely to use words like anxious or worried or concerned than people with extroversion preferences. Also more likely to use words like cautious or careful, but extroverts, on the other hand, were more likely to say they felt restricted or confined or inhibited or constrained, which sort of makes sense to me. And there was also quite a few differences in terms of thinking and feeling. And those with a feeling preference were more likely to feel anxious or stressed or overwhelmed or lonely or isolated. Whereas those with a thinking preference were more likely to think the whole thing was overhyped and overblown, or to use words like change or disruption, but more often in a positive way than in a negative way. And of course, you can then see some of these differences playing out for whole type as well. So take that theme, the most common theme of feeling anxious or worried or concerned. This graph is going to show the average number of times this theme was mentioned by each type. So if you look at ISTJ there at the left, for example, you'll see that the little dot is just a little above the 0.6 mark. That means that just over 60% of ISTJs mentioned feeling anxious, worried, concerned, fearful, or scared. If you go on to the next type, ISFJ, around 50% mention this type, and so on. Now, if you look across all the types, you can see there's quite a significant up and down, quite a significant variation there, but generally speaking, with the exception of INTJ and to some extent INTP, most introverted preferences are more likely to feel more anxious than most extroverted preferences, with the exception of ESTP. Now, on the previous slide, we also saw there is a thinking-feeling difference as well as an extroversion-introversion effect. And ESFJ and ESFP, sorry, ENFJ and ENFJ, I've put too many things on my screen, I can't see my slides. A dominant extroverted feeling were also likely to feel anxious. And some differences only really reveal themselves when you look at whole type or the functions. For example, the theme of feeling bored or indifferent or apathetic. Here is those with dominant extroverted sensing, ESTP and ESFP, who are most likely to express those feelings, which again made a certain amount of sense to me when I look at the data. So what we've seen then is that people in general tended to be more negative than positive when expressing their feelings about COVID. And it's interesting, when I listened to your words, there were some negative things in there, but I would say more positive things than we found in our survey. And that might apply a little bit to where we are now in the life cycle of a pandemic. But one of the things we were interested in this research was, as well as your overall feelings, what about specific questions about people or their working lives? And we were, in the field that we work in, particularly interested in their working lives. So we're going to try a few more specific questions out on you now. So in a moment, you're going to see these questions come up in a poll. I think they'll come up, if I write Sarah, in one poll. So you have to go from question to question. And what I'd like you to do when the poll appears is to just answer each of those questions on that scale from strongly disagree through to strongly agree. Okay, so if you'd like to answer those poll questions now. So you're still reading it. We have a few answers coming in now. So getting on for a third of you have voted. Over half, 2/3, 70%. They're getting a, there's a couple more people, see if we can make it 100%. One person not quite decided. Okay, let's end the, oh, well, everybody's voted. Let's end the polling there and share the results. Oh. So that first question, I am more anxious than before the pandemic. So on balance, I think we have a disagree. So 80% strongly disagree, 47% disagree. So well over half disagree or strongly disagree. Life is too quiet now. We have, again, although agree is the most common category, on balance, more strongly disagree or disagree than agree or strongly agree. And I miss having people around me is a bit more of a 50-50 split, just slightly on the disagree side of that one. Everyone had a chance to see those poll results? Let me stop sharing those then. Let's look to see what came out of our survey. And again, this may have been at a slightly earlier stage of the pandemic. So that first question, I am more anxious than usual, actually was a pretty much a 50-50 split. So 14% strongly disagree, 35% disagree, 37% agree, and 40% strongly agree, very much in the middle. Now, we scored these questions on a 1 to 4 basis, with 1 for strongly disagree, 2 for disagree, 3 for agree, 4 for strongly agree. So if the average was bang in the middle, we'd expect an average score of 2.5. That makes sense to people? Excellent. I'm seeing some nods. And the average for our first question was pretty much bang on 2.5. Whereas the second question, life is too quiet now. On balance, people tended to disagree with that question. And people tended to agree with that question, I miss having people around me. Those are the overall results. But of course, there were some type differences as well. And people with type preferences did answer some questions differently. So along the bottom of the screen, you can see at the moment, here are the questions in our survey that people with extroversion preferences answered in a different way to people with introversion preferences. On the left, you can see the scale from strongly disagree up to strongly agree. And we're going to look at the average response for people with an extroversion preference and the average response for people with an introversion preference. So anything above that thick black line, that's at that 2.5 mark again, people on average agreed with. Anything below, on average, we disagreed with. So if you look at that first statement, for example, I'm enjoying the peace and quiet of working from home, both extroverts, that's the orange dot, and introverts, that's the blue dot. Both groups tend to agree, but introverts agree more. There's a similar result for the next question. Working from home is giving me the space and time to reflect and take stock. And here's the results. Actually, let me just give you a chance to look at those other questions momentarily. Let me give you a chance to look at those other questions momentarily. Have a think what you think the differences might be. It's probably fairly predictable, if I'm honest. This is what the actual results said. And that's partly why I asked you that question before about streaming services, because introverts tended to disagree with that, extroverts more in the middle. The biggest differences are on those last two questions. Extroverts on average definitely said they miss having people around. Introverts are in the middle, some agree, some disagree. Introverts tended to very much disagree with the idea that life is too quiet now. Extroverts in the middle, some agreed, some disagreed. There are also some sensing, intuition, and judging, perceiving differences. So, for example, those with a sensing preference tend to find it more difficult to keep focused. Those with a judging preference were more likely to say they settled into routine. But actually, the greatest number of differences was between thinking and feeling. And here are those differences. These are all statistically significant differences. For those of you who like stats, they all had moderate effect sizes. And I summarize these results by saying, first of all, that most people were happy they had the IT stuff to work from home, although those with a thinking preference were, on average, just a little bit happier. But probably more importantly, there's a big TF difference in how positive people felt about working from home. People with a feeling preference or working from home in a less positive way than those with a thinking preference. And you might remember from the earlier slide, people with a feeling preference also tended to use more negative words to describe their feelings, the more general feelings about the pandemic. Now that last question, I feel guilty, but I still have a job, is interesting. This is the full question that we ask people. I feel guilty, but I still have a job when others have been laid off or furloughed. Now, if you yourself work for an organization where this has happened to people, but you're still in work, you might want to think about how you would answer that particular question. Overall, this is how our respondents answered it. And if you look at those two columns at the right, 26% agreed, 5% strongly agreed, 31%, just less than a third, either agreed or strongly agreed to some extent with that statement. But if you look then at the thinking group and the feeling group separately, it's a very different picture. Only 21% of people with a thinking preference agreed or strongly agreed, but 41% of those with a feeling preference. And if you look at whole type, those differences are, of course, even starker. In fact, if you look at this graph in detail, you'll see that on average, every feeling type is more likely to agree than every thinking type. Now, there's quite a few reasons why this personality difference could be important. One of them is obviously about the well-being of individuals. And in our research, we did find that those who experience survivor guilt, whatever their type, those people were also more likely to agree that they were worried about their co-workers and were more anxious in general, and that they were finding it more difficult to concentrate and to remain focused on their work, which is an issue for individuals, but also for organizations. We also found that survivor guilt seemed to be increasing over time, at least in the 3 months we ran this survey for. And it's also important to remember that managers and executives are far more likely to have a thinking than a feeling personality preference, and may therefore be less prone to survivor guilt themselves, and may therefore be less likely to notice it in other people or to take it seriously in other people, which could have some serious consequences. And the survey results, I guess, were something of a wake-up call for me personally, because my preferences are for INTP. And if you look at that graph, you see that people with INTP preferences were one of the least likely groups to experience survivor guilt, and so possibly, I'm afraid, one of the least likely groups of people to notice it in others. Now, there's a lot more of that research that we haven't had the time to go into today, but we'll make the research available to you along with the slides of this presentation, and you can actually download a short summary of that research from the conference website already, or just get in touch with me and I can send you the full report. It is about 100 pages, but there's lots of good stuff in it. But let's just summarize what we've talked about in terms of research so far. We saw that negative words predominated in describing people's feelings about the pandemic, especially perhaps words around being anxious or worried or concerned or fearful or scared. But in contrast, when you ask people more specific questions about their working lives, the answers tend to be just that little bit more positive. And actually, we found that was especially the case for remote workers, but despite the fact they were arguably in a more dangerous place, it applied to non-remote workers too. People with a preference for extroversion were more likely to be missing contact with other people, and many miss having people around. saw life as too quiet, worried about becoming too isolated, and maybe watching more TV or streaming services than before. And people with a feeling preference were more likely to use negative words to describe their feelings, were significantly less positive about working from home, and more likely to feel guilty that they still had a job when others had lost theirs. And I've already showed you the full type results for that last question. Again, there were similar full type differences for all of these issues. So we've talked about some of the effects of the Spanish flu and about how the current pandemic is affecting us and about how that's influenced by type. But here's a question for you. What happens next? What happens when, hopefully, which is why I put the big no entry sign, COVID is over and done with, or at least properly under control? What changes will we see in society, in the workplace, in education? And an extra question, how can type help with this? What role can type play? And how can type practitioners help? What role can type practitioners play? And I was hoping to give you 10 minutes to have a discussion on this in breakout groups. But let's just go for a very quick, if we could go put those groups up, Sarah, a very quick 5-minute discussion to get your top of your head ideas for those. Please join the groups. I'll be back here for a quick discussion in 5 minutes. See you soon. And here we go. Just wait for everybody to get back. Let me just change my display so I can see everybody. Okay, welcome back. So we have just a few minutes. So let's have a spokesperson for one of the groups just to say a few things about, and I know it's a huge topic and one you probably want to think about and talk about a lot more after this, but a few things that you thought about in answer to those 2 questions. Over to whoever wants to talk.
I can go. Actually, I'm copy pasting our comments in the chat right now, so everybody has it for posterity. So the focus seemed to have been work-wise, how is work from home timings, office buildings, even, you know, infrastructure, how that is going to be effective.
Yeah.
The technological aspects, we've seen a lot of new apps coming out and a lot of new just, you know, digital advantages or developments in the digital space that some people are more likely to early adopt than others. And it basically overall how having the type awareness can help you adapt to these changes, and how as type practitioners we can support others using this beautiful framework to you know, mitigate strengths and bridging gaps.
Excellent, thank you, Doris. And it's interesting that some of the previous research we did some years ago about things like type and working in an office and office environments is actually coming back to be quite useful now as well. Okay, thank you. Let's have a spokesperson from one of the other groups, please. Whoever wants to go.
I could just say a quick word.
Okay.
I was trying to draw on the question of personality, how they process the environment.
Yeah.
As to whether the pandemic itself hasn't had enough of a historic impact to change the behaviours culturally and ritualistically of particular types. And I was projecting my worldview, I guess, as an introvert or an extrovert who seem to need to make daily and regular contact with each other. And if anything cultural was going to change, it was going to happen within the rituals of extroverts who seem to need to be in the tribe, as it were. And I think that the idea, if there was going to be any change, we'd see it in extroverts like it had taken hold of their collective psyche.
Right. And I think it's interesting to think about how people of extroversion preference do cope with this world of Zoomers. And some people seem to actually quite like it because they connect with lots of, and others, no, let me have people. Any other comments from that group? Or from the third group?
I don't remember where was I in the third group?
I don't know.
I know. I don't know what group number it was.
Any let me rephrase that question.
Okay.
Anybody have anything they'd like to say?
Okay. Well, one thing is, like, I know Colonel tried to get us back on topic, but we had 2 INTPs and INFP in our group, and but I think there were I think a couple of people were saying that they thought a lot of things would go back to regular and to normal. I think it depends on your perspective a lot, because I've been working in office for 30 years now. I'm a software developer, and so I can see drastic changes that are probably going to happen because of this. Based on, partly driven by companies. I'm actually getting contacted a lot on LinkedIn by recruiters looking for me to work remotely for them from other parts of the country, because I have a specialization in some areas that is hard to find. So I think a lot of employers are going to be looking, and it's actually now they're starting to see how remote work works. So they're looking to expand that. And then also it saves them money, because then they can have less people in the office, and they can do, and maybe a lot of companies are going to go more towards a hot desking type of thing, where you come in and find a space, and they estimate that only a certain number of people are going to be in the office at one time, maybe have, a certain amount of days per week people are remote, and certain amount that they're in the office. That way they end up saving an office space. And some things that I thought would happen for as far as type practitioners, I think since this model is very different, having people in the office, not in the office, doing a lot more, maybe not completely remote, but a lot more remote type work, is a different thing. And maybe wanting to try and figure out how we can do this best, and which people need to be in the office and which people don't, and how do we handle all of this?
I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things we talked about earlier on, it probably seems like hours ago now, was the way that the Spanish flu pandemic really accelerated existing trends. And after all, one of the trends which was here before COVID was this stuff, remote working. And it's just really supercharged that. And it's not to say that things are different always, they may exacerbate existing trends. I fear we may have run out of time a little bit. However, does anybody have any final things they want to say that haven't been said? Thank you also for your earlier comments in the chat. I've tried to answer some of them. Otherwise,
what the unanswered question, isn't it? What role can type and type practitioners play? Is there a role for type practitioners? Is that something you're going to conclude on?
Yes, I am. And I'm going to conclude on a question. Is there a role for type practitioners? And what would that role be? And I'm not going to give you an answer, because I don't know the answer. But it's something for you perhaps to think about. Maybe just share a glass of red wine with in the one of the bars in a little while. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. If you've got any other questions, do get in touch. As I said, I'll be around for the rest of today, actually not right into the evening, but most of the rest of today and also tomorrow. Otherwise, drop me an email. Do download that document as well as the research. It has a little bit on type guidelines, type-based guidelines for remote working in there as well. Drop me an email if you want the full report, which, as I said, has a lot more stuff in it. Thank you very much.
So thank you, John, and I'm sure we'd all like to express our appreciation to John. That was fascinating and very interesting information and statistics, and pulling thoughts out of that. So thank you, John.
Thank you.
I'm going to end the meeting now and just encourage everybody